So, Juan, thank you so much for talking with me. I want to start at the very beginning, which is where and when were you born?
All right. I was born in Edinburgh, Texas, which is part of the Rio Grande Valley. Edinburgh is about 18, 20 miles from the Mexican border, across from Tamaulipas. I was born in March of 1983, and I grew up down by the border.
Does that make you a Pisces?
It does make me a Pisces, yes, yeah.
So, do you feel like a sensitive, caring, occasionally indecisive kind of person or not?
I've been told that from time to time, and something about water signs and the whole nine. Yeah, I get that a lot. But partly it has to do with growing up in the borderlands, right? And being aware of the surroundings and of the culture, the community. So you could blame it on me being that Pisces, that water sign, but I think it has a lot to do with the geographical location where I grew up.
How many generations of your family lived in Texas?
So on my father's side, my father was born in Texas. His mother was born in Texas, and her parents immigrated from northern Mexico. But my father's side of the family, they were like my father and his mother. They were all born on the farm worker trail, right? So they grew up. They were born as the family was traveling up north to follow cotton. And on my mother's side, my mother was born in Texas, but she was raised in Nuevo León, Mexico. So it's a little interesting on how we could categorize those generations because the life of the farm worker was very transient, right? So even though they were born and lived in Texas, it was quite a different lifestyle as folks who were, who stuck around in one place and really had the ability to grow in one direction. Yeah, they were seasonal farm workers and they followed the crops throughout the state of Texas and throughout the country, right? And the same thing with my mother. As early as a teenager, she was coming to the States to work. She would travel to California and work grapes for several years. Uh, so both my families are farm workers.
And what was their attitude towards education? It used to be among the Chicanos that I knew that the emphasis was you work for La Familia. You don't want to go to college because you want to get a job and help out the family. But that's really changed. So I wondered how it was for them in terms of getting an education.
Well, we'll start off with my father. Now, my father lost his father at a very young age, right? And we're talking about a time that Chicanos in Texas were really fighting for equality in education, right? Just about everyone who was Spanish surnamed, was forced to repeat the first grade a couple of times. And my dad, you know, lived through that, you know, uh, and I later in life I pieced it together, because one thing I would have these conversations with my dad, and I asked him, do you remember when John Kennedy was assassinated? And of course, Kennedy's assassinated in '63. That would have been, my dad would have been about 15 years old, and he told me, yeah, I remember the exactly where I was, and he was telling me that at the age of 15 he was still going to Travis Elementary.
Oh, gee. Oh, my goodness.
And then I started to piece it together, like there's no way you could have been in the fifth grade still. And he told me, that's just where he was, right? So, he was part of that generation where, he had to work before school and after school. And upon his father's death, it was primarily more work, right? So I think he might have made it up to the eighth grade, and that was about it, right? Um, the village where my mother grew up in Nuevo León, it was a little ejido, La Palmita, Nuevo León. Uh, the little village only had up to fourth grade. And that was it, fourth grade, and that was your education, right? I think their parents would keep them in there to repeat the fourth grade a couple of times, but as they were getting older, they were getting pushed out because the school didn't have space for them anymore. So their whole life was always about work. Fortunately, though, I have an older sister, and they always pushed education on both of us, right? They always wanted us to go to college. College, I don't think not going to college was an option for us. So
Wow.
it was you're gonna graduate high school and you're gonna go to college, right? So they knew that if we were to become something of ourselves, that going to college was going to be beneficial, right? So my sister's 5.5 years older than me, Yesenia, and when she graduated college, I started college, right? And she became a school teacher, and I just never left college. I I got my bachelor's degree, and then I pursued a master's degree, and then I went off to get a PhD. But yeah, they were huge proponents of us becoming educated.
So when you were a child, were they settled, or were they following the crops when you were growing up?
I was lucky because my dad was still working the cotton gins up in West Texas up to about when I was about 3, 4 years old, and he would leave. He would leave us for the cotton season, go to West Texas, and come back. But mom had a full-time job. Mom had a full-time job for Hager's, the pant factory. They had a local plant there in Edinburgh, right? And about the time that I turned 3, mom quit the factory and opened up a daycare at home. So this meant that we didn't have to be seasonal workers. And around this time, Dad also found a job as a custodian at the local high school. And this put us at a different level in the sense that we weren't making more money, but this meant that our family didn't have to travel anymore, right? This meant that Dad didn't have to go and leave the family for a couple of months to make money. And this was quite different from the rest of my family, who were all seasonal farm workers, right? And South Texas, the valley, as we call it, the Rio Grande Valley, has a great amount of agriculture. But during the summer months, it all dies off because of heat, and people would have to leave South Texas. A lot of my family growing up would go out to West Texas, Memphis, Florida, Plainview, Lubbock area to work, mostly in La Limpia, Limpia del Algodón, cleaning up the cotton harvest. But this meant that we didn't have to do that, right? Both my parents had year-round jobs, especially by the time that I'm 3, 4 years old, and we didn't have to do any of that, right? So I was very, very fortunate in that sense, right? And of course, this meant more stability, right? This meant that you started and you finished the school year in the same school,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to some of my primos and primas who, would leave early May, late May, or even after the school year ended, and then sometimes wouldn't be back until mid-September, late September, October sometimes, and have to start the school year in Colorado or wherever, right? So that was a great benefit for my sister and I.
Yes. In terms of terminology, which is preferred? Latinx, Latin, Hispanic, Chicano, Mexican American. What's the?
I'm a Chicano. I'm a Chicano. I identify with the term Chicano. Growing up in South Texas, my father grew up during the Chicano movement, and he didn't share much with me. He was a real shy guy, but I remember, he would take me to school every morning, and I was talking about how this new school that I was going in South Texas, we always identified as Mexican American. Um, and I had this conversation going on with him that morning. He's like, yeah, you could really tell the difference between the mostly Mexican students in school, because the school that I was going to had more white students, right? That opposed to the elementary school that I had gone to. And he goes, mijo, we're Chicano. And that was like one of the few times that my dad was aggressive about anything. And he goes, mijo, we're Chicano. You're a Chicano. And it's later in life that I really became interested in the Chicano movement and Chicano history, that like I really learned what my father was trying to tell me back then, right? And I think I could, to a certain extent, comprehend what he was telling me back then. But as I grew older, I could really comprehend what he was telling me, right? That we were Mexican American, that we were Chicano, and that there was a certain amount of whether you want to call it pride or acknowledgement of who you are as a person. That's what he was trying to convey, right? But I definitely do identify as Chicano, Mexican American. The more I move out of Texas, and we see, and I come around folks from other parts of Latino America, that the term Latino gets thrown around, right? But Chicano. I'm fine with Chicano, Mexican American.
The kind of stereotype, and what I see often in practice, and it was portrayed in this 1997 film Fools Rush In, is that kids in Chicano families grow up with extended family, and they get together often, and there's you have influence from your aunts and your uncles and your cousins. And in that movie they show the Anglo guy has this little tiny nuclear family. They're not that involved. How fair is that as a kind of a stereotype?
It is a stereotype, but there's always some truth to stereotypes, right? Uh, and in my household, my home was the hub, because my grandmother, my mother's mother, as she was getting older in age, she stayed with us. My mother never wanted my grandmother to be on her own. Like, even though my grandma had her own house till the day she passed away, it was a block away from us. And it started off where, as my sister was getting older, she'd go stay with her, so she wouldn't spend the night by herself. But then eventually, she would stay the nights with us, right? So I always grew up that there was there was a family responsibility in taking care of grandma. So I would spend the afternoons with grandma, walk her over to the house. But on the weekend, she would stay with us. So this meant that the family would come visit. My tias, my tios, my primas, my primos would all come and visit grandma. So yeah, I did grow up, having those connections to the extended family. And of course, it wasn't just my primos and primas that would come visit her, but her brothers and her sisters that were still living would come visit. So you grow up knowing that there's more to the family other than the immediate family, right? And my father's family was somewhat different. People were, because of his background with how the family moved around with that farm worker lifestyle. I had aunts and uncles in San Antonio and Idaho and New Mexico and West Texas. So his family was a bit more spread out. The family, as they traveled, my aunts and uncles, they fell in love and got married on the farm worker trail, right? So this meant that our family was all over the place, right? So yeah, I definitely grew up, not just with having close bonds with my immediate family, but with the extended family, for sure.
The recent books about American boys in general, like Naomi Way and Peggy Ornstein, I think that's her first name, say that teenage boys are lonely, they're told not to have close friendships with other boys because people might think they were gay or queer or whatever the word is, and that they really get taught to shut down their feelings. But I'm wondering if that's true more for Anglo families and not so true for Latinx families, because if you have the extended family, it's hard to be lonely.
It's hard to be lonely, but we learn gender roles from our family, right? Um, and to a certain extent, there's truth to that. When I was a kid, I was heavily influenced by my uncles on my mother's side, and had an uncle who was, and we'll get into this discussion earlier on the term machista and things like that, because there's more than meets the eye to the terminology. But I had an uncle who was he really embraced these negative attributes of machismo. But for instance, he told me as a kid, men aren't supposed to smile. Men aren't supposed to smile.
Oh, I never heard that one.
And he's like, only clowns and queers smile in photographs. And as a kid, you're like, well, he's my uncle. He must be right about this, right?
Yeah, he's a grown up.
He's a grown up, right? You trust him, right? And for a very long time, I did not know how to smile. I was traumatized as a kid that, okay, well, I'm definitely not a clown, and I guess I'm not queer, so maybe I shouldn't be smiling in photos, right? But yeah, it does create some type of whether it's a social anxiety or some type of loneliness where you're restricted to certain behaviors, right? Or a very common one as a kid growing up in the 80s is los hombres no lloran, right? Or los machos no lloran, right? So as a young boy, you're not supposed to cry, right? And maybe it wasn't a comment that was directly told to you to embrace these masculine ideals, but there's probably, as a kid, they're probably trying to tell you not to cry. You fell, comfort yourself and get back up and do this or that. But it does have an impact on boys of my generation, on men of my generation. So I think to a certain extent that there is some of that exists in our culture, right? Yeah.
Mm. I want to come back to this because you've done a lot of writing and research about these gender roles, but so much is happening that seems so bizarre in Texas. And how can they outlaw abortion? How can they make voting rights so difficult? How can they pass these draconian laws when almost half the population is Hispanic? And those voter limitation laws are directed at Hispanics.
Right. So when I teach a class, I tell my students that, I'm going to cover 200 years of history, 500 years of history here. A couple of lessons to really grasp from history is the following. I tell them, you're going to see a pattern that, whenever a group of people has lost power or is losing power, they will do all they can to maintain that power. All right. We see this with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan post-Civil War. We're seeing it with the rise of, we saw it with the rise of strong nationalism in the 1920s, 1930s. We're seeing it right now.
With the Trumpites.
Oh, of course, because the numbers don't lie, right? White Texans, white Americans who fear these change of demographics are extremely fearful on what's going to happen, right? In Spanish, we have a saying, el león cree que todos son de su condición. The lion feels that everyone is of his condition, right? And what does the lion do? What did white Americans do for a very long time against people of color, right? And of course, I'm not saying that all white Americans were oppressive towards people of color, right? But that absolutely happened in our history, right? And the fear is that with the demographic change, that Latino population, Chicano population, Hispanic population is going to arise to oppress white folks, right? I think there's a certain fear of that.
Wow.
Right? And you see it every now and then that, oh, this wave of migration is taking over. Well, you could stop migration right now, and the Latino population is going to continue to grow. Right? The reason that this is happening in Texas, Latinos are a very young population, right? So I heard something the other day that every 30 seconds, a Latino turns 18 years of age, right? So all these laws are happening while a good number of Latinos still cannot vote in Texas, right, because of their age, right? And I think the state government is realizing this, and this is where they're trying to curb, what they can at the moment before this age group jumps up to that 18-year-old level where they can vote, right? This is all happening as they're trying to deal with the projected demographic shift, right?
Well, it's happened. It's not projected. There's about as many Anglos and Hispanics in Texas, about equal.
Yeah. The only thing is that for the most part, these are younger Latinos right now who are still not able to vote, right? And I think that's the big deal, because if you look at the K through 12 numbers, a great number of those students are Latino, are Hispanic, right? But a very young group of people here that we're talking about. Still, the powers that be are white folks, right? The way that districts are gerrymandered in Texas, it's insane, right? And I lived through a lot of that. The way they were cutting up districts has been nuts down there.
I read that Governor Abbott was hit by a tree when he was jogging, and I wonder if that influenced his mental abilities, because this new abortion thing with vigilantes just seems so off base, so extreme and bizarre.
Absolutely. This is the most restrictive law against women in 50 years, right? And what people like Governor Abbott have going on, the DeSantis of the world, some of these extreme right-wingers, the right wing has always had the best propaganda, right? And the only thing that they got going on for themselves right now is fighting this made-up boogeyman, right? They have these so-called culture wars going on because none of their policies are forward-thinking. All of their policies, for the most part, are extremely backwards, right? Just how they've handled COVID. Texas has been brutalized by COVID, so has Florida, right? But they stick to their guns, and they want to be these tough macho men who are, standing firm in these cultural wars, and they pick on, the undocumented folks. They pick on women. They pick on communities of color. And you hear it time again. These folks in Texas, they blamed COVID on, first of all, it was hoax, right? But now that it's not a hoax, they picked on the African-American community. They picked on the Latino community. And so has DeSantis in Florida. He's picked on the immigrant community time and time again on how they've been these spreaders of COVID, right?
And he's Cuban-American, right? I mean, he's Latino. DeSantis.
Is he?
I think so. We'll have to check. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, but the Cuban community in Florida is historically has been very different politically to the rest of the Latino population nationally, right?
Yeah. So do you think wearing a mask is seen as feminine, and if you're a real man, you don't wear a mask? Is that part of this machismo thing?
Well, to these idiots, yes. To these idiots, yes, because there's a difference between being tough and taking precaution, right?
And being
You know,
smart and being stupid. Well, and Abbott got COVID.
yeah, he ended up having COVID, already being vaccinated, and of course having a lot of the drugs that are not available to you or me
Yeah.
disposable to him, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, these people live in a very different reality, right? Very different reality. Absolutely. But yeah, there is, and it was all echoed coming from from people like Trump, right? Where, he was making fun of Joe Biden one week about wearing masks. And 10 days later, or not even 10 days, like 5 days later, he had COVID himself, right? But yeah, there's still a lot of that going on in our society where, people refuse to wear a mask thinking that, well, one, is it feminine to be wearing a mask? Or two, what are you protecting yourself from? Because they really did not comprehend what COVID was. And of course, that it was a politicized pandemic, which should never gotten to that, right? But absolutely, right? And I think growing up, you got a little bit of that, some of that false sense of manliness, that you take risks because you're a man. You take, but it's really nonsense, right? And I think to a certain extent we've seen that during the pandemic.
That's interesting. It's true that women are more likely to get vaccinated than men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, so since we're talking about machismo, you wrote From Death Valley to the Rio Grande Valley, World War II, Korean War prisoners of war, I'm Not Gonna Die in This Damn Place, Manliness, Identity, and the Survival of the Mexican American Vietnam Prisoners of War, and then Mexican American Baseball in South Texas. So, what got you interested in prisoners of war, two historical periods, and then what got you interested in baseball?
All right. So when I was a master's student, I was really trying to figure out a topic for my master's thesis. And my advisor, he's like, well, why don't you look at Mexican Americans in the military, right? And I started wrestling with World War II in Korea. And I started looking at the participation of Mexican Americans in those two wars. And I got in touch with a good friend. He wasn't a friend at the time, but he's become one of my best friends, Jose Omar Rivera from Mission, Texas. And Omar is just one of the best researchers ever. And at the time, he was very much into, and still is, into the military participation of Mexican Americans. And after brainstorming with Omar, we came up with the topic of prisoners of war, right? And Omar had done a lot of the research already. He had identified so many POWs in the area. I began to identify the ones who were still living, and this is 2006. So that generation was up there in age, and they were dying off.
Yeah.
So I began to identify those who were living, those who had passed, and the newspapers at the time were just incredible on how much coverage they gave to POWs. Right, the World War II era were incredible. The Korean War newspapers were also incredible. And this is the time where newspapers still had morning edition and evening edition. And it'd be interesting, like for the Korean War, you'd read headlines, Reds capture 10 American POWs, one from Edinburgh or McAllen, right? So the newspapers gave these guys a ton of coverage. And as I was going through the literature, there were great limitations on scholarly works being done on veterans and especially POWs. Mm. So I thought this was a nice little niche, and yeah, I went around and began interviewing these men, their families, and I began to record their history, and I wrote a master's thesis on them. And as I was preparing to go into a doctoral program, I thought, well, I've done World War II in Korea. I ended up going to Texas Tech University, which has the largest archive on the Vietnam War in the world.
Oh.
And it makes sense to expand to Vietnam, right? And that's what I focused on for the doctoral dissertation. And then I began to see a huge difference between the Vietnam POWs and the Korean War and World War II POWs. So where a lot of the World War II POWs and Korean War POWs was a much more diverse group, the Vietnam War group was not diverse at all, right? So, the large majority of POWs in Vietnam were white officers belonging to the Air Force and Navy.
Oh.
These are the John McCain types that were, shot down on their missions over North Vietnam, as opposed to the World War II guys, the Korean War guys, that those wars attracted more foot soldiers, and there was a variety of POWs. That was not the case in Vietnam. And in the 1960s, 1970s, to fly a plane, you needed to be an officer. This usually meant college-educated folks. So you have a limited number of African-American, Latino POWs in Nam.
Mm.
And a lot of the infantry that was captured in the South, a lot of them weren't captured. They were killed, executed. There was a very small number of men that were coming out of as POWs from South Vietnam. So this meant that there was a lot more to that dynamic, right? And I really wanted to investigate more. Huge difference between that infantry guy, most of them, definitely not career-oriented military folks, quite younger for the most part. And here's where you see a greater number of African American, greater number of Mexican American. So I began to identify these guys, and yeah, I went across the country interviewing them, right? And I wanted to know their lives before the war. Growing up, all of them were from the Southwest, and I really wanted to see what was pushing them towards the military, right? And of course, I use manliness as one of these factors that was pushing them in that direction.
What
Right?
does that mean, really?
Well, this is what I really wanted to investigate, and a lot of them, how do we identify what is manliness, right? And I really began to go in depth on these manly ideals, right? And it's not what's hot, right? It's not that they wanted to go out there and prove their toughness in the battlefield. It wasn't that they wanted to go out and get as many kills as they could. A lot of them wanted what a lot of them wanted was training. A lot of them wanted was training to come back home
GI
and get a nice job, right? And we're talking about a time where a lot of the men were motivated by the draft, right? They were so afraid of being drafted and just being thrown in there that they said, okay, well, maybe if we volunteer and we pick our specialty, our MOS, maybe this gives us a little bit of input on where we're going to end up, right? So a lot of this, I was trying to tie back to the Cold War mentality of the ideal family wage, where in this Cold War mentality, especially for the World War II generation, the Korean War generation, they were being told, right, that the middle class American family, the father, husband has a decent job with an ideal salary that will be helpful to raise the family, to keep the wife at home where she could be the caretaker. So Mexican Americans and communities of color who were aspiring to that middle class, we're buying into this, right? Whether how true it was or not, it's another argument, right? But they wanted to partake in this booming economy of the Cold War and come back to a society where they could grow and live prosperous, right? And for a lot of these men coming out of the Southwest from extreme poverty, the military had certain could offer some of that, right? Could offer some of that social mobility that they were aspiring
And that's
to.
still true, right? That the military has more men and women of color than their population percentage because of that. Because it's hard to get ahead in your little rural area,
Right.
so you go in the military.
Yeah. Today the figures are almost reflective of the population. The number of Latinos in the military maybe a little bit higher, but it's at par with the population. Unfortunately, and this is something that I've been looking at recently, it doesn't always transition to moving up the military hierarchy. There's still a tremendous void when we're looking at not just Latinos, African Americans, but women as well. The number of these folks transitioning to the 3-star rank, the 4-star rank, we still see a limitation there, and I've been looking at that closely here recently.
What do you think? I mean, is it just plain prejudice, or there's some kind of structural barriers, or maybe they're not as educated? What do you think is the problem?
I think it's a little bit of both. When during Vietnam, what you heard time and time again, when the rate of African Americans was extremely disproportionate, when the rate of Mexican Americans was really disproportionate, what folks began to say, was that these men were volunteering for, dangerous jobs such as, airborne divisions and whatnot. And what they were saying was that the bonuses that airborne divisions were offering were of interest to these underrepresented communities, right? These folks that came from a lower social economic status. But it speaks to the structure, right? To the system. It speaks to not only the system in the military, but the system in our society, right? That leaves these people out to dry sometimes. And in the military, that has been time, and like today, that's one of the arguments that I've seen, that Latinos tend to go into the infantry, or Latinos are attracted to certain specializations that keep them from going up that social ladder in the military. And of course, the other thing to look at is education, right? How many African Americans, how many Latinos are going to places like West Point, right? To the Naval Academy, right? It's also something to look at, and that's the thing, that sometimes we tend to say, well, this is a military issue, this is an Army issue, this is a Navy issue, this is a societal issue, right? This is a societal issue, and we can't leave those things apart, right? But what my research really took me to was a deep dive into masculinity and machismo. And I began to heavily research machismo amongst Latinos, amongst natives who we have that strong native influence, right? That native culture, a heritage. And I dedicated a chapter in what my dissertation became a book. I'm Not Going to Die in This Damn Place. And chapter 3 in there really looks at this sense of machismo, masculinity. So I went back to the Pueblo natives of the Southwest, right? and how they were impacted with the incoming of Spanish conquistadores and the Spanish missionaries that came into the Southwest, and their whole notion of masculinity transformed with the arrival of the European. Right? The Spanish really threw out their the sexual aspect of of what they considered to be machismo, manliness, right? But a couple of things that had always been associated with manliness in Pueblo society was two things: the hunter being the provider, and warfare, right? Things that we've seen similar in definitely in our society, right? And then I really began to investigate how Mexican writers looked at machismo. So I went back to like writers of the 1920s and 1930s, people like Samuel Ramos and Vicente, I can't think of his name right now, but Vicente Mendoza. And these philosophers and writers going back to the 1930s, they were really trying to articulate, what it meant to be a man, right? And Vicente Mendoza, in his writing, he identified two forms of machismo. One that was embracing things like, the provider, having that responsibility to the family, making sure that the family was disciplined, and making sure that they grew up with all that they needed to become successful. Things like the stoicism, more positive traits than negative. And then he also identifies a negative form of machismo, and this is something that is, for the most part, in the mainstream, when they hear the term macho, they tend to identify with all the negative, right? Things such as the womanizer, the oppressed, associated with dominance, right? And the more we progressed in society, that negative image took over some of those positive traits of what it meant to be a macho, right? And I even looked at works such as Gloria Anzaldúa, right? Gloria Anzaldúa from my neck of the woods down in South Texas, was looking at gender relations in rural South Texas, and really also talked about some of those positive macho traits growing up, and of course the father being tied to being this kind of like the caballero type who took on certain roles for the family, right? So the more we progress in society, sometimes we can't even have these conversations. People tend to really just look at some of these negative aspects of machismo, and not looking at some of the positives. And that was one thing that I really wanted to do in my book, where I really wanted to say, hey, these men were attracted to so many other aspects of society, and not necessarily some of the negative aspects that we associate with men and warfare, and whatnot. So yeah, I really dove into machismo, and I began to differentiate. That there were different ways of viewing machismo for folks from a rural area like I came from, to inner city. People like in Mexico City and growing populations, and I tried to make sense out of this loaded term, right?
In cities, that means gangs, right?
To a certain extent, yeah. You do see that, right? And it's funny that you bring that up, because when I was in Michigan, I did some work in the prison system. I would go to a couple of prisons there, and I got invited a few times. It started off with going to give a talk for Cinco de Mayo, and then one of the groups LASO, Latin American Spanish Speaking Organization. It was a group of young men who really wanted to learn more about their heritage. They invited me to become their sponsor.
Wait, was that in prison?
Yeah, this was in prison.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would go to the prison there in Jackson, Cooper Street facility, twice a month, and I would attend their meetings, and I'd talk to the young men, and this is as I'm writing my book, finishing up my book, and you know, they grew up with this idea of embracing all these falsehoods about masculinity and machismo.
Being tough.
Being
Fighting.
tough, being in this gang world, being in, you know, growing up Chicano, Latino, sometimes you have all these crazy ideas on what it means to be a man, right? You can't be a man unless you father X amount of children, right? You can't be a man unless, you're out there, with all types of women, right? You can't be a man if you're not out there drinking and doing drugs. And these young men, for a very long time, they grew up with that mindset that you had to embrace all these very dangerous lifestyles to be considered a man in the barrio, in your neighborhood. So, I really began to have these conversations with them, on what it, because they were at the point, a lot of them were about to be released from prison. A lot of them had some more time to spend, and I really wanted them to be aware of what society was like when they were going to get out, right? A lot of them had to find a job when they got out, and they had to be responsible either for family that they already had or that they were going to have. So, and this was a wonderful exercise. I think they got a lot out of it. I got a lot out of it. And I'm in the middle of writing a piece on my experience working with these young men, right? Yeah.
What did you find, if any, differences between Chicano, Black, Anglo POWs?
So, as far as the numbers go, there is only about 10 Mexican American POWs in Vietnam, right? And well, to begin with, the number of POWs in Vietnam was not very large, right? Probably closer to about 600 to 700 POWs as compared to the thousands and thousands in the previous wars. It was only about 16 African American, and the rest were mostly white, right? And it had to do with a couple of things. One, it had to do with military branch, right? But one thing that overall, and this is something that I highlight in my book, amongst the Mexican American POWs that I talked to, one thing that did not bother them too much. All these men grew up with extreme limitations in the Southwest. A lot of them came from farm worker backgrounds. This meant that they were out there as kids working the fields. These were kids of the Depression era, World War II era, where a lot of them went to bed hungry. And I guess some of those aspects transitioned well to a POW camp.
They were used to hardship and adversity.
Yeah. And this was something similar with some of the African American POWs, especially the guys coming out of the South, where South Vietnam, these were pretty much makeshift POW camps that existed in remote areas, where usually the person who became the head of that camp as far as prisoner was the healthiest and the most hardworking POW, right? And this was true for both African Americans and Mexican Americans. Um, in North Vietnam, because of the structural and because of the POW camps themselves in North Vietnam, the structure in North Vietnam was very much similar to a formal prison in the States. It was a much more formal prison system. And in North Vietnam, these officers quickly set up a rank system, right? And according to the code of conduct, the most senior is to take command, and the most senior is supposed to relay command throughout the rest of the POWs, right? So in the North, it's extremely structured, and of course, always taking leadership in the North are these senior POWs who are white, right? So there's a huge difference between those guys who were up in North Vietnam as opposed to the guys coming in from the South. And as soon as these guys get, because they're all eventually transferred over to North Vietnam, but as soon as these guys make it over to North Vietnam, they start noticing the difference. And one thing that they could all agree on, or that they could eventually realize, that the social structure, the power structure, was always white, right? And of course, if you're a grunt, whether a Marine, an infantry from the Army, who saw hand-to-hand combat, who saw the war up close and personal, it's going to be a little difficult. It was a little difficult for them to take directive from a person that outside their branch, who definitely did not live the war up close and personal, and who, of course, was always white, right? There was a major difference between the ranks, right? So that was, I think, one of the big differences here. Right?
I interviewed a Chicano who spent a lot of time in California prisons, and he said what was interesting to me is that in prison it's very much your ethnic group who you hang with, and he
Right.
said that among the Latinx population, it's not okay to have sex, whereas you can't have like some guy that you're having a sexual relation. They're more morally straight, I guess you would say. That they have a strict code of ethics. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Two things that you that reminds me of. When I was doing the Korean War POWs, the literature in the Korean War looked at sexual relations amongst the POWs. Yeah. And this was not something that I could find in the Vietnam War literature, but it definitely came up in Korea. Right. Going back to this group that I worked with, Lasso would not permit drug users, that if they were consuming drugs in the prison, they didn't want you there. And their creed also spoke. They had bylaws, they had rules, and they frowned upon, sexual relations amongst prisoners as well.
And do you think that's unique to Hispanics? I mean, I wonder if there's the same kind of code among like the white Aryan Brotherhood gangs or the African American gangs, or is that unique to Hispanics?
One thing that I found out with machismo, that machismo was not something that was solely Latino or Mexican based. In my research, I looked at these masculine ideals amongst people like Teddy Roosevelt, and there were issues that were across the board, and I'm willing to bet that this also is applicable to various other groups. I don't think it's solely a Latino issue.
If we're talking about machismo, we also have to talk about Marianismo and the influence of the Catholic Church, which probably has a lot to do with defining both. So the woman is supposed to be Mary-like, which means pure, virgin. You're supposed to have a chaperone if you go out with a boy until you're married. How much of that Marianismo is still true for young Hispanics that you know of?
To a certain extent. So my family was quite untraditional in that sense. Or, well, let me explain. Uh, both my parents worked, and this meant that, unlike other of my family, like some of my aunts and uncles, my parents had a very interesting relationship where my mom really was the disciplinarian in the household. My mom was really the one who decided things, right? My father pretty much went along with everything my mom suggested. If we wanted to do something, we asked mom, not dad. And my dad was totally fine with that. He was always there for us, but he deferred to mom. He did defer to mom. She was pretty much the brains of the operation, right? But I was a chaperone for my sister, well into my teenage years, right? Mm-hmm. She was in college, and I would still tag along to things, when she went out with her boyfriend. And yeah, that was totally a thing in my family, right? I would go everywhere with them. I'd be stuck in a park in the middle of nowhere. I'd be stuck at a dance, just sitting there because I was a chaperone, right? And this is something that has both positive and negative consequences, because by that same thinking, Latino families, Chicano families, Mexican families, we tend to keep a close grasp of what our women are doing, but we also give young men the liberty of living, right? Of being out in the streets. And of course, this leads to consequences, right? When I was working with those young men in prison, this is one of those direct results where, we give men or young boys all this free range. And of course, this often leads to them getting into trouble, right? And this is something that I clearly address. I would address with these young men. And it's something that I address in my teaching. When I teach about this kind of stuff, is that we really need to take a look at, how we're raising our young men as well, right? It's not about just giving them the liberty, because a lot of them and are finding themselves to be in trouble, right? But yeah, you're right. It is an important thing to look at. Yeah.
Is it fair to say still that most Hispanics are Catholic, and how observant? And I think there's a growing evangelical wave as well. So what's the role of Catholicism, priests, nuns, in shaping our gender roles as
Right.
Latinx?
I grew up Methodist.
Really?
I grew up Methodist with a lot of Catholic traditions. My mom was the only one of 9 born in the U.S., but raised in Mexico. And my grandmother she came to visit family, and she had my mom. She had my mom prematurely, and her relative would not allow her to go back to Mexico until they baptized my mother. And my mom's padrino, Abel Zamora, he was a World War II veteran. And I want to say he was my grandmother's cousin, and he would not allow my grandmother to go back to Mexico until they baptized my mom. So they baptized my mom Methodist, and later in life, when she came back to the States, and she was trying to get married, she said, "Hey, I'm going to get married through that church where I got baptized." So they got married through the Methodist church, and we were raised Methodist, but with a lot of Catholic traditions, right? And that was always a little different, because the majority of the students in my school growing up elementary school, we're Catholic, right? And we grew up with all those traditions, especially during Lent and Christmas and whatnot. But it was interesting, juggling, you know, two different, two different, the Methodist traditions and the Catholic traditions. But you're right. To a certain extent, the Catholic Church, from a surface level, does portray those divisions, right? Those the gender divisions of labor. Let's call it that, right? The priests, the nuns, all right, and of course, you're expected to follow some of those images, right? Where young women, young girls are expected to, keep their virginity until marriage, right? So yeah, you definitely you see that to a certain extent, and it does have influence. But in the last 2 decades, you've seen tremendous growth of Protestantism amongst Latinos. My mentor at Texas Tech, he did some work on Hispanics in Mormon Zion, Hispanics in the Mormon Church. The Mormon Church is one of the fastest growing in Latin America.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's growing tremendous. It has grown for quite a while, and you're right about the evangelical, growth in the Latino community, right? But yeah, it definitely does. But Mexico being such a large Catholic country, definitely does have its influences. Yeah, and in the last 5-10 years, there's been so much work done. Felipe Hinojosa has a book on Latino Mennonites. So there's been some historical works done on other groups now.
A big thing for Latina girls is a quinceanera when they're 15, the coming of age, and it's a big deal. Is there anything like that for boys, or there's no acknowledgement, okay, this is your initiation into manhood?
Yeah, there's such thing as quinceañeros.
Oh,
Uh, yeah, I think they were probably a little bit more popular maybe 2 decades ago or a decade ago. But I attended a few quinceañeras in my time, and where either sometimes it was a big party such as a quinceañera, and sometimes it was just something more family. Uh, but yeah, like in my family, I have an aunt who would always gift us something for our 15th birthday, and I think she gave my cousins and I. Like a ring when we turned 15 as part of that ceremony. Uh, but yeah, for young men, sometimes it's a hunting trip, right? A hunting trip, a fishing trip down there in South Texas, where they go out and try to go get their first kill or whatnot. It varies from place to place. Uh, but yeah, those quinceañeras are. Now they've become just so consumeristic. They used to be family affairs where the family would come together, do the cooking and do the arrangements and all that. Nowadays, families are spending $20,000-$30,000 on these.
it's like a wedding.
Oh, it's beyond. It's too much. But it really does speak to not only consumerism but its appeal to the Latino community, right? It's become like even keeping up with the Joneses, where
Like a status symbol.
yeah, hmm yeah, absolutely,
So I can spend money on this big hall and this big dress and this caterer and this band, and it shows how prosperous our family is and how much in debt.
yeah, 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 yeah. It's ridiculous. I remember my sister had a quinceañera growing up, and it was nothing extreme. For the time, it was a nice party, but it was part of that cultural norm where you know young women got this. I think at 15, the rule in the family was at 15 you can dance with boys, and you could wear makeup.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And there's nothing like that for most boys to, except as you said, the hunting trip or the something like that, but it's not as formal or as common.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
it's more like getting your license to drive or being a father, or I don't know what it is.
Right. I'll tell you what it is. It's discrimination.
Yeah.
No, it's not. It's just it is a type of discrimination against women where, you know, it's a symbol where, okay, well, now you can do X, Y, and Z.
Well, you're marriageable, so we're having everybody look at you and say, "Oh, think about
Yeah,
her for a wife."
right.
At 15.
And I think some of that gets a little bit blended because there's certain aspects of our culture and society where even though, yeah, you're marriageable, nowadays, of course, you're not marriageable, but it's still that tradition that you have a party at 15, right? Um, yeah, but it can get really deep, the thinking behind the quinceañera.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um, so you're married. Do you have kids at this point?
I'm not married and I do not have kids.
Oh, I read somewhere that your wife, da da da.
I'm divorced.
Okay, you had one. Got
Yeah.
it. Um, so what else? I wanted to ask you about your students, and a big issue for boys is, it seems to me, is they're not as likely to go to grad school and undergraduate school around the world except in sub-Saharan Africa. So the question is, why is that? Not just in any community, boys are less likely to go to college. What do you see in your students?
Uh, we've seen a shift, right? A shift, uh, going back 40, 50 years where the majority of the students were males, right?
Yeah.
In this country, to where we're at now. Um, I could give you a couple of examples and then we could branch off on the bigger picture here. But uh, young men of my generation in Texas, especially once the oil boom began, um, they saw that there wasn't a need to go to college, right? The oil boom of the mid 2000s, early 2000s, really attracted a lot of young men who said, "Hey, you know what? I don't need to go to college. I could go work for one of the refineries, and I'll be making much more money, and I'll be doing manly work, quote unquote, uh, and that's fine for me. That's fine for me." And a lot of these young men, and I have one second cousin who unfortunately died on one of these job sites. Died very young. He's probably about 23 when he got killed. And a lot of these men were out there doing these very risky jobs, right? And that physical labor attracted them, right? Wanting to be a roughneck or a welder out there, and it really spoke to their masculine ideals, right? In Michigan, I saw it as well,
Hmm.
where uh, going back to the boom of the auto industry, the boom of the big three, GM, Chrysler, Ford, a lot of these, and men, and also women, right, who said, you know what, I don't need to go to college. I can go to work for Shop, what they call, the auto industry, Shop, what they call GM. I could go to work for Shop out of high school, and I'm going to be, set for life. I have a nice union job. I'm going to be set.
Good benefits.
Great benefits, right? Great pay, you know, and yeah, this attracted a lot of men and women, but a lot of men, right? Uh, and and women, on the other hand, you kind of saw them, getting into universities more and more, colleges and universities. But it speaks to the gender division of labor that exists. right? And also to some of these masculine ideals that attracted some of these men.
What do you see in your students today? You're like, do you teach undergrads first year and they're
I
18?
Yeah, I teach a lot of undergrads. I teach some seniors and juniors, and I'll also teach graduates. So I get a good mix. I get a good mix of all. Um, I think students nowadays are really, going to college. They know that they want a decent paying job, and that attracts them. I'm at a teaching university that attracts a great number of first generation students.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, a lot of them come with these ideas of, wanting to go into the STEM fields that have been expanding and growing, as opposed to going into the humanities and arts that have taken a huge hit in the last 2 decades or so.
Mm.
Right? But yeah, absolutely, they're definitely attracted to, uh, looking at what their career outlook may be.
They have to when they're going to graduate with at least $25,000 debt. It's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
they have to. The studies show that there's increasing numbers of young people who are anxious and depressed. Do you find that the college is paying attention to those mental health issues, and do you see them pop up among your students?
They are. I think all universities are looking at this. We see the expansion of services that are offered throughout campuses, and I've worked at several campuses now, and you know these talks have definitely grown in the last 2 decades when I first started teaching, and you see the rise of the services that are offered across campuses. And it is, it is a big deal. I think for this generation that of college students, most of their life has had a tremendous influence by technology, right? By these metrics that people see online, by a society that has always lived by the influence of social media and what comes with it, right? You post something on social media, well, how many likes did that have? You know, so they live with so many pressures that I don't think they've fully articulated a life without it, right? So it's not easy for this generation of students that is going to school right now. So I always consider that, this generation of students has so much pressures because, when we were a kid, when I was a kid, your your school world and your personal world were almost very isolated from one another. You know, every now and then, you had your little friends and you'd give your phone number to a certain friend and, oh, is it all right for, you go to Manny's house this week and he's having a birthday party. It was very limited, right? Or is Jaimito coming over? As opposed to the world of today where these two worlds are always blended for students, right? Because of social media, because of the internet, they always have access to either world, right? And of course, this leads to confrontations outside the classroom. This leads to all types of behaviors online. And I think these well, they're not children anymore, right? These students of today deal with so much more than what I dealt with, right? Every now and then, maybe you saw somebody outside of school and you thought, wow, this person, my teacher also goes to HEB, right? They grocery shop just like each and every, right? As opposed to the world of today where the world in many ways has become smaller, right? So these students grow up with so much pressure.
I think that's key. But boys are more likely to do video games and girls more likely to do social media. Do you let your students be on their phones in your classroom?
I try not to. But the thing about some of these video games nowadays is that they're not just playing those video games by themselves. They're playing these video games with classmates online, right? And they could communicate with each other. Like they put on these headsets and they're talking to, whoever they want. So in a sense, some of these video games are also, they're social. They are social, right? So yeah, that complicates things. I try not to allow students to use smart devices in the classroom. Even I even have a limitation on laptops. And studies show that the student learns more when they're actually writing down things. There's a connection that is made as they're writing down notes as opposed to typing down notes, right? And they don't need another distraction in there, because a lot of these computers, they could be texting, they could be, looking up things online. So I really try to limit the use of smart devices, computers in the classroom.
I saw a video of a big Midwestern college lecture class, in the tiered big room, and you could see the screens, and they're playing games and solitaire and texting, and there's a whole lot going on those screens.
Yeah, and I tell students, if you guys rather do that, I'm sure you could do that in the comfort of your dorm room couch. It might be more comfortable to do that there than it is in the classroom, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard because more and more we're exposed to all these distractions, right? And this country hasn't really started treating internet use as an addiction, and it really is. It's an extreme addiction.
Did you hear that China just said kids can only watch 3 hours?
Yep.
What I want to know is how they're going to enforce that.
Right. How are they going to enforce it? But, the Chinese have been ahead of this. Like a decade ago, they were talking about treating internet addiction.
Yeah. Right.
And I think as a society, Americans are nowhere near ready to tackle some of these issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a few more questions. Let's finish your book list so far. What did you find with the baseball, Mexican American baseball in South Texas?
So as I was looking at masculinity, and I was looking at masculinity in Chicano neighborhoods, and a couple things popped up. There's a few behaviors that stood up as far as being connected to manliness. One was fighting, and the other one was sports. So fighting, of course, I connected that with military service, but the other thing was sports, and how sports was used as a way, also social mobility. But I was really at a point in my career, young career at that time, where I just defended my dissertation. I was a lecturer down in South Texas, and I really didn't have any funding for research or for travel or anything like that. So I went back to my good buddy Omar Rivera, and Omar Rivera is just a genius, and he's like, his brain is just so full of all these potential topics that he cared for researching, but he never really cared to write anything about. So he tells me, okay, well, there's a particular team in 1962 out of my home county, Hidalgo County, that competed and won the Colt League World Series. This is 15, 16-year-olds that competed and won this World Series in Shawnee, Oklahoma. And there had never been anything written about it. So I began to do the research, and this was a team. And what really spoke to me, and it wasn't just baseball that drew my attention, but I was really trying to write a community history of what was going on in South Texas in the 60s. And this baseball team was divided down the line. There's 8 Mexican-American young boys and 8 white young boys. Okay? And we're still talking about a time where South Texas had a good number of, of white folks in the area, right? And still segregated. You had your Mexican barrios, even though the majority of the people were Mexican American. There's still segregation going on here, right? So I began to get interested in the community, and I began interviewing some of these ball players, right? But it really spoke to some of these ideals, and uh, growing up in the community, athletes were always respected. Athletes were always respected, even when peer pressure uh, was around, and all athletes had to say, "Hey, I don't want to take a smoke. I don't want to take a drink because I'm a deportista. Soy deportista. I'm an athlete. I don't drink. I don't smoke." And that got a lot of the peer pressure off of you, right? So I really was expanding that aspect of masculinity, but really it was a project that was got me away from doing some of the more traumatic work with prisoners of war, and it was a refresher project for me. Uh, but it still spoke to some of these manly ideals, quote unquote. So I spent a little bit of time working on baseball, um, and it was connected. The two topics were connected because as I started doing the research, a lot of these World War II guys came back home, and of course at the time they weren't calling it PTSD. PTSD is a term that came out of the Vietnam War. But at that time they were calling it shell
Shell
shock.
shock.
They're calling it post World War II syndrome. But a lot of these men coming back from World War II Korea began to develop baseball leagues throughout South Texas.
Hmm.
Just about every town had a semi-professional team, right? And I really, I really argue that it was kind of a form of distraction or a coping mechanism for them to deal with the combat stress disorder that they were dealing with.
A
And
support system and feeling
oh,
they were doing good.
absolutely, absolutely. And also for Mexican Americans in South Texas, sport was a way of becoming integrated in the community and a part of becoming Americanized, right?
Mm.
There's a reason you embrace baseball and football and basketball and not soccer, especially of my generation, where soccer was still seen as an immigrant sport, right? I love soccer; it's the sport of the world. But in Texas at the time, it was seen as a sport for Mexicans, for immigrants. And a friend of mine who does work on soccer, he grew up in a part of Texas where soccer was seen as a sport for women, right? So yeah, there's a reason why it was baseball that they embraced, right? But it also speaks to the U.S. military and how they took baseball to all kinds of corners of the world, right? Uh, so, and again, one of the themes that I've tried to do in whether it's the military book, whether it's the baseball stuff, is just representing how Latinos have been involved in these two worlds and how underrepresented they are uh, in the type of academic works that have been done. Right? It really tried to fill a void in their participation.
What's your next book?
So right now, I'm really hoping to get launched on the Korea book. I'm working backwards from Vietnam to Korea, and I really want to tie this in with political identity and their you know the Korean War is referred to as the forgotten war, and the contributions of Latino in the military are quite the same. They're all often forgotten, right? So I'm going to look at the Latino participation in the Korean War era. Right.
Got it. Is there a MECHA, some kind of student organization for Latino kids at your college?
They have a Lasso group that is guided towards Latino students. They have a dance club. Mecha, to my understanding, has not been very active on our campus. But it'd be nice to get the students involved and get them aware of some of the works of Mecha.
Yeah. I just want to go back to what you said, that the conquistadors changed the gender relations in the pueblos. And is that because before it was kind of matrilineal and women were important and honored, and they changed that?
They did. They did. You know, going back to the Pueblo, a young boy, gained his rites of passage through hunting trips,
Initiation, going to the wilderness alone.
right? And what this meant was that this young man, young boy, could do a couple of things. He could provide for the family with food, and his initiation in where there is military training or an aspect of that also meant that this young boy could respond in protecting the family, right? From what I read, Ramon Gutierrez says when Jesus came, the corn mothers went away. Ramon talks a little bit about how some of these changes occurred, and when the Spanish came into the area, they set up something for in military combat and being victorious out in the military field. For every native that a Spanish killed, they were entitled to a native woman sexually, right? And eventually, from according to Gutierrez, this eventually translated to native men doing the same. That eventually they began to take over some of those behaviors as well, much to the abuse of native women, right? And so what Gutierrez is saying is that masculinity was tied to sexual gratification or sexual conquest, right? So it was very different from before. Right?
There's also the concept of how do you say it? Calabrino, caballerismo.
Caballerismo.
And that's an old Spanish kind of knight chivalry honor kind of a concept.
Right, and this is what some of the positive aspects of machismo. This is something that I put in my book, is that there's a code of chivalry, right? There's an honorable way of treating not only women but children, the elderly, and this is something that people like Facundo Valdez wrote about. Facundo Valdez had a piece on vergüenza, shame, right? And one of the worst things that they could tell you growing up is that you're a sin vergüenza, you're shameless, right? Because a shameless person does not have a code of ethics, does not have a code of honor. A sinvergüenza is not trustworthy. A sinvergüenza's word doesn't mean anything. And part of this caballerismo is that your word means something, right? You say something that means something. Your word is what you have, and you don't break it for no one, right? And it's some of those positive attributions to manliness. People like Jerry Teo. I don't know if you're familiar with Jerry Teo. Jerry Teo has a compadres network, and he's still around today. He does workshops across the country and looks at the positive of manliness and machismo. He has this concept of el hombre noble, the noble man, and very ingrained with caballerismo, where there's certain certain ways of behaving it goes back to some of these very ancient forms of thinking, right?
How do you
Uh,
spell his last name?
Theo, Tello, Jerry Theo.
And did you hear any of those concepts when you were growing up?
Absolutely.
Oh, good.
Oh, absolutely. Uh, you're never supposed to hit women. Never hit women. You're there to take care of your sister, even though she's older than you. Uh, you know, you never, you never cuss in front of women. Uh, you know, you provide. You open the door for children, for women, for elderly. There was you had a code. You had a code of how to behave, right? And these aspects weren't negative, right? It didn't say, go sleep around with as many women as you can. They were all positive. There's a positiveness to caballerismo, people will say, folks who are critical, well, it's part of the patriarchy. Well, yeah, we come from a very patriarchal society, but doesn't mean that everything is negative about that society, right?
So, do you think that you got more guidance about what it was to be a man than, say, a boy growing up in an Anglo family in the same area?
Uh, I don't know if I could say that, but I will say this is that we had we had double the work to do because not only did we have cultural norms coming from this Mexican Chicano household, but we had societal norms because part of being Chicano means that you're American, right? That you live in the United States and that you have to adjust to some of those social norms. So, I had to adjust not only to my Chicano heritage, Mexican heritage, but also, an American society. So it's almost like double the work to be one, right? Uh, you know, by the time that I was growing up in the '80s, white flight had taken place in South Texas. A lot of the white folks who came in early on that century, in the 19 teens, 1920s, there's a huge number of Midwesterners that relocated to South Texas to grow their fortunes. By the time that I was a kid, a lot of them had left. A lot of them had left. I grew up in a society that was 95% Mexican American, right? So it was quite different. But you also have those uh, geographical societal norms, right? Where uh, you know white children also had to embrace some of those norms as well. Right? So yeah, it's a mixed batch there.
Hmm. Are you involved with any men's studies organizations, journals? Do you keep up with that?
I'm trying more and more, and you know, uh, when I was in Michigan, I was just so swamped with the work that I was doing with the inmates. Uh, my university has a group. It's like a brotherhood, and I've been. So the weird thing is that as soon as I moved to Connecticut, what was it, like 5 months later, the pandemic hit, and we all got pushed to remote. So it's been a process just trying to get integrated with the school with everything that's been going on. But I definitely want to connect more with this brotherhood, and it's just really showing young men that despite of what is out there in popular society, that there's more. There's more to being a man than they may be aware. Right? Uh, I definitely have aspirations to get definitely more involved.
Is the Brotherhood is for all boys, no matter their ethnic background, kind of an organization?
It is.
And
It
it's for
is.
teens, or is it for college students too?
It's college students. It's college students at the university.
Oh, so it's
Mhm.
like a group, a support group for male college students.
Right. It's a support group for male college students.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um,
I still mentor some of the former prisoners some that write me from prison, some of them who contacted me as soon as they got out. So I still I bond with them. They're helping me write this piece on the organization, and I've got them, putting pieces together for me, and it's been fun.
on what organization?
The group Lasso that I spoke of, in the group of prisoners that I work with.
Got it. Oh, that'll be good.
Yeah, yeah.
That'll
So
be interesting. Last question. The men's movement. People don't hear about it in the same way that people hear about feminism or the women's movement. Because of your interest in roles, I wondered if you follow or are interested in branches of the men's movement. Mythopoetic, father's rights, pro-feminist, whatever it is.
right. When I saw your question, it reminded me of a lot that is going on right now. But it really reminded me of something out of a sitcom out of the 1990s, which at the time when I was watching this television show, Married with Children, the lead character played by Ed O'Neill, Al Bundy, has a group of men that form this group called No Ma'am. And of course, it's very misogynistic. It's very like, hey, I'm not going to become feminine, things like that. And the reason why it was hilarious is because a lot of men felt that way. And we're seeing that today, where there's a backlash in society. And women, to a certain extent, conservative women have embraced this type of mentality.
Like the
Where,
Promise Keepers or those kind of guys.
right, right. Um, and to me, it really speaks to the insecurities in
Mm.
society that some of these men have. And you see it everywhere. The president of my university is a woman. And there's faculty members that are intimidated by that. There's faculty members that feel that it's a problem, right?
What
But
are they afraid that she'll be too emotional or she'll favor women or what do you know what they're afraid of?
see, that's the thing that we're not quite certain what they're afraid of. But in this society, in today, just like Donald Trump was a backlash to the Obama years, right? There's groups that are definitely fearful, are insecure of their place in society, and buy into these notions that, hey, we need to go back to a lifestyle of yesteryear, right? And you see that with groups such as the Proud Boys and some of these
Oath
very,
keepers.
yeah, so some of these right wing groups, right? Uh, as I have not had the opportunity to get as involved as much as I'd like to. Uh, but one thing that I always tell folks is that in order to really study men, you need to study women, and if you want to study women, you need to study men as well.
That's
There's a
why I'm writing
balance,
this book.
right? Right. So you really can't have women study without men study,
Right.
or vice versa, right? Um, so yeah, I'm in the middle of really acclimating myself to this new campus and really getting more involved with some of these groups.
So
Right.
what do you teach? What are the titles of your classes?
So uh, I began coordinating the minor Latino and Puerto Rican Studies. So I teach the introduction course for that minor, Intro to Latino Studies. This semester, I'm teaching a course on Puerto Rico and Latinos in the United States. Right. Last semester, I taught a course on Latinos and civil rights. Right. I also taught a course on oral history. I taught a course on community history, community and public history. right? Uh, so I teach a variety of courses. I also taught a course on race and ethnicity, which not only looked at Latinos but other underrepresented communities. So I've been teaching an array of courses since I arrived here.
Yeah. Is there an active women's studies
There
program on
is,
campus?
there is an active women's studies, and I'm actually going to their next meeting in 2 weeks. Yeah.
Good.
So yeah, it's been a decent adjustment here. Well, the pandemic got in the way, but what are you going to do?
Wait, when I at Chico State for a while, we had a Department of Ethnic Women's Studies, and that worked really well. It was great. Um, Anything else that you would like to add that we haven't talked about in terms of understanding men or boys or Chicanos? Big topics, but anything else that comes to mind?
Uh, there's an often divide. Um, when you're looking at gender issues and cultural issues, and I've had people at conferences confront me about this, especially when I was looking at, the false notion of machismo and the positive notion of machismo. A Latina woman confronted me, and they're like, well, Latino male do oppress Latina women, and sometimes, and that is true, right? That can be true, right? I'm not going to defend the actions of other men, right? Especially when they're negative like that, right? But it really does impact, how much we can grow and learn about gender dynamics, right? And I think often that is what leads to people shutting down and not being able to have these discussions, right? Uh, and and it's different. It's awkward because this term machismo or macho, time and time again, I think it has been used by Anglo society to neutralize Latino male, who say, well, you guys are oppressors just like us. Like, well, there's more to that, right? Um, and that's one thing that I've noticed. When I've talked about some of these issues at conferences, where some folks really don't even want to listen to it, right? But I ask for patience when discussing this, because these are very sensitive topics, right? These are sensitive topics, and once we shut down, it stops us from really growing and learning. Yeah.
So you mean they don't want to hear about the positive aspects of machismo?
Right, right, yeah. I've gotten some criticism on how it's just part of the patriarchy,
Well,
and
that's true, but as you say, that if it stresses honor, responsibility, your word being good, no one can fault that.
right, and I think some of that leads to some of the cultural dilemma that exists today. Uh, when discussing gender relations overall in this country, uh, there needs to be an avenue for acceptance and discussion. And I think we're at a point as a society where uh, you really can't have any of that sometimes, right?
Mm.
And
You,
and and there's definitely a breakdown of communication.
I don't know if you find this, but every group that I've been in, the kind of liberal progressive group, it always ends up with little factions and divisions as to who's the most politically pure. So it's like, oh, you're more pure, I'm not as pure, and then that ends up being this kind of divisiveness. Every group I think that I know of. I don't know if you found that or not.
Yeah, absolutely, right. Absolutely, like it becomes about who's more progressive, right?
Right.
And that's the thing. And when I was telling you about the right wing, all they have to really figure out is, hey, this is about Jesus and guns and what's the third thing that they really care about?
Keeping women
Uh,
at home.
Jesus, guns, and taxes, and that umbrella covers, a lot of their agendas. And as opposed to folks on the left, where there's all kinds of issues that are pertinent, right? So yeah, it's almost self-destructive in the sense
Yeah.
where it does cause problems, right? As far as organizing and just getting people on the same agenda, it's like herding cats sometimes. Yeah,
That is so true. That is
yeah,
really interesting. I hadn't thought about the right wing being so unified because it's so simplistic.
yeah. It's very simplistic, right? It's good guys versus bad guys, and according to our former president, who used the best words, it was always bad guy this and good guy this. It was like talking to 4-year-olds,
What did
right?
he say? Bad hombres come from Mexico and rape women?
Yeah, these are bad hombres down there, right? Yeah, and yeah, we're at that point in our society. Yeah.
Do you think Biden is helping heal it? Do you have hope, or do you think we're
Oh,
not
oh
going?
no, the damage that was done to the presidency, uh, I don't think is fixable. Definitely not in 4 years. Uh, when Trump was elected, I think a lot of us realized that the presidency and our country was never going to be the same again, right? Uh, and despite what people want to believe, this is not something that you fix in 4 years. This is not something that you fix in a decade, right? Even though Americans have such an attention a short attention span, these issues have been ongoing, right? And 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 if you look at some of the stuff that was coming out of the Russians, the Russians really wanted to create and strike a division in society, and I think they were very successful in doing that,
Yeah,
right?
just
Uh,
using social media
yeah,
effectively.
yeah, and social media is the worst, right? Because it doesn't even become as social media at that point. It's people just texting you some of these memes and negative news stories or made up news stories that really strike at Americans' heart, right? And is responsible for a lot of the social anxiety that is out there and the social divisions that exist, right? So we're talking about a society that is dealing with a lot of these divisions, right? And I think when we look back, we're going to look back at some of the divisions that existed during the Civil War era, right? Some of the divisions that existed during the abolition movement, some of the difference that existed in the 1950s and 1960s. I think this is the one for this generation, right? Where these relationships have divided families, have divided households. Right?
My hope is that under Obama, people talked about a post-racist society and how wonderful it is we elected African American. So my hope is that Trump revealed no, there's still racism, sexism, all those divisions, and that he could illuminate it and bring it to the surface to be healed. That's my hope.
Well, it reminds me of, because none of that is true, of the post-Obama year, the post-race. I don't know what term you use, but that's definitely not true for Obama, right? We did not have a post-racial society, right? The only reason we got Barack Obama elected was because of the blunder of the George W. Bush years, right? Jesus himself could have ran as a Republican. There was no chance in hell to win after what George W. Bush did to this country.
Mm.
There's no way. There's no way. And when Trump got elected, I read a story where Barack Obama was talking to a few of his insiders, and he's talking about how did we get this all wrong these years? Meaning that if you put them on paper, right, there's no way Donald Trump should defeat Hillary Clinton. There's just no way. There's no way. And what President Obama was alluding to was were we going the wrong path the last few years that the American voter has essentially said no to an extension of the Obama years in electing Trump? And that's what he was telling insiders. He really took it to heart.
Mm.
He took Hillary's defeat to heart, and thinking that, hey, were we going the wrong direction? He began to question the direction the country was headed in under his direction, right? Uh, and yeah, we were being. I think some folks were being idealistic, but you know, we can't have an Obama without a George W. Bush, and we tend to isolate these things and not see the bigger picture. But Barack Obama's election is resulted of what George W. Bush did to this country, right? Starting these two insane wars without any direction, right? I think the country would have been crazy if they would have elected a even though in retrospect, John McCain looks a rational person now, right? But at the time, there was just no way. There was no way he was gonna be elected president, right? And people forget that, right? We have to start evaluating things in context, right?
That's why you're a historian.
Well, I'm trying to be one.
I have a friend who actually thinks that Hillary Clinton drinks baby's blood.
Yeah, just like that psycho who went into that pizza shop in D.C. or wherever it was, right?
DC,
because because it was a center for child trafficking, whatever. Yeah, some people believe this garbage,
yeah.
Right? And you know what the worst part is? Well, there's several things wrong with this, but there's people who make money off of this. They're banking on the divisions that exist in our society. Yeah, it's a wild times that we're living under.
What's interesting to me is how effective Russia was in aggravating the divisions and Russia probably got Trump elected. And I think they're the same size economy as California or something. They're not that much of a mega power, but Putin was really smart in using these underhanded propaganda techniques to divide us and get Trump elected. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, and Americans have done this for ages, right?
We've interfered, and
America has interfered in so many elections, right? And it just makes you wonder, like
karma.
Yeah. So
great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. This is terrific.